Welcome to today's webinar, ProAct Now, Planning Effectively in a Rapidly Changing World. Hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will post it on our website early next week under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to get smart growth news and information and learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also learn about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is ProAct Now, Planning Effectively in a Rapidly Changing World. You can also search for event number 919-8157. So to get started, our speakers today are David Rouse and Ben Hitchings. David Rouse, FAICP, is a consultant, author, and educator with nearly 40 years of experience in community planning and design. He is the former Managing Director of Research and Advisory Services for the American Planning Association and was a principal at Wallace Robertson Todd, a nationally recognized planning and design firm based in Philadelphia. His areas of expertise include comprehensive planning, parks and open space planning, green infrastructure, and planning for emerging technologies. David is an accomplished speaker and has published widely on a variety of planning and design topics. Many of his projects have been recognized with awards for excellence from planning professional organizations. Ben Hitchings, FAICP and CZO, is principal of Green Heron Planning LLC and is a member of the APA Board of Directors. A past president of the North Carolina chapter of the American Planning Association, Ben has more than 25 years of experience working on planning issues. He is the former planning director for the town of Chapel Hill and the town of Morrisville, both in North Carolina. He has managed and developed award-winning plans at a local and regional levels. In his planning practices, he focuses on emerging issues, innovative plans and codes, and catalyzing effective plan implementation. Following their presentations, David and Ben will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time during their presentations by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And so now I'm going to turn it over to David and Ben. Welcome.
Here with David Rouse, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It seems like our world has changed a lot in recent weeks, and one sign of this is that even the golden arches are now staying 6 feet apart. Some of you may have seen McDonald's revised its logo in many places to support the need for social distancing. So truly a challenging time. The polar ice caps are melting while Australia burns. Online shopping is changing the nature of retail, and automation is changing the nature of work. And as our world changes around us, communities and local governments have long operated in a multi-objective environment. We have lots of things that we have to address. However, the number, pace, and impact of emerging issues are stressing the ability of our communities and organizations to respond effectively. the world is changing rapidly, and the question for us is, are we ready for it? And so that question was what prompted David and myself to work together over recent months to try and understand the panoply of different issues that are facing our communities and devise a methodology for trying to help communities to better prepare themselves in a rapidly changing world. We'd like to start off with an audience flash poll. We've got a couple of questions for you. We want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So our first question is, in what kind of organization do you work? This polling format allows for 5 options. And so let's see, I'm going to, let's see, the poll is open. Let's see, and I think everyone can see the choices on question 1. Michael, do we need to do anything special on the polling?
No, in fact, it's open now. It's local government, state or federal government, private consulting firm, nonprofit organization, or other.
So those are your choices. We'd love to have you take a minute and respond. Just let us know what kind of organization you work for.
They can now see the responses. 44% are in local government, 20% in private consulting, 18% state or federal government, 8% nonprofit, and 10% other.
Great. Well, so looks like we've got a good diversity of folks joining us here today. Thanks again for being with us. So now our second question for you is, which emerging issue do you think will have the greatest impact on your community in the next 5 years? And we've got 5 choices again. David and I just picked a sampling from some of the different topics that we're going to cover today. And so the choices are A, e-commerce, B, automation, C, an aging population, D, new mobility, and E, climate change. So again, we'd love to have you take a minute and share your thoughts on this question.
So the responses here, 35% climate change, 25% aging population, 19% e-commerce, 15% new mobility, and 6% automation.
Great. Thanks so much. We appreciate your follow-up. And so now I'd like to turn the program over to David Rouse. David?
Thanks, Ben, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to have you joining us on this Friday afternoon in really different circumstances than even a month ago. But hopefully this will be worthwhile, and what you see in front of you is the agenda for what we're going to cover in the bulk of the webinar. First, we're going to provide an overview of major forces, what we call drivers of change, that are acting globally and in communities across the nation. We'll then consider examples of what those drivers mean for local communities, and we're going to end by addressing the question how communities can prepare for the change that is coming. And we're going to introduce a new methodology that Ben and I have been developing over the last several months. We're calling it ProAct Now. And we will have time at the end for Q&A. So let's start with the drivers of change. We define drivers of change as universal forces that are making change happen in our communities, whether we are ready or not. And as you can see, we categorize them to 4 broad categories: social, technological, economic, and environmental. So let's go through these one at a time. These are the ones we're going to cover in this presentation. So under social, we have aging population, declining health, equity, diversity, inclusion, and immigration. Under technological, we have artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, new mobility, and smart cities. Under economic, we have automation, e-commerce, ethical consumption, and the sharing economy. In the fourth category, environmental, we have climate change, changing energy sources, natural resource depletion, and globalization. Now, I'll make a couple key points before we dive into these. First of all, there are many points of overlap and interconnection between the different drivers. And there are other drivers out there we know that come into play as well, but these are the ones we'll be focusing on. And an overall message is that the challenge for communities is the need to address these drivers in a proactive, integrated way, rather than a piecemeal, reactive way if they are successfully to prepare for change. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ben. We're going to be playing tag team throughout the presentation to dive into the first. But first, Ben, let me say, I want to tell the audience that we're going to go through a lot of material, but we are going to make a PDF of our presentation available, and we're going to give you a link where you can go access at the end of the presentation. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the first set of drivers of change.
Great, thanks, David. So we're going to start with the social drivers, and let's dive right in here with one that we've been wrestling with in recent years and decades, an aging population. The U.S. Census estimates that by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 years of age or older. And by 2034, the census projects that older adults will outnumber children for the first time in U.S. history. So this marks an important shift from a youth-dependent population to an old age-dependent population, with about 2 dependents for every 3 people in the workforce nationwide. And as our population gets older, we know we're going to need to continue to adapt our housing, our transportation, our community facilities, and other services to help promote the health, productivity, and social engagement of older adults. So that's one key issue. The census, you'll notice on the left, provided this nice infographic showing the distribution of population in 1960. It was more of a pyramid, with the base of the pyramid being the younger generation, younger cohorts. And then by 2060, they project that it will be more like a pillar, with a pretty even distribution of folks across the different age cohorts. A second topic under the social category is declining health, and particularly the cost of chronic diseases. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that 90% of the $3.5 trillion that we spend every year on healthcare in the United States is for people with chronic and mental health conditions. There's also increasing documentation, of course, on the disparities in health outcomes between affluent and poor populations, and a growing attention to the role of social determinants of health, such as economic stability, access to health care, access to healthy foods, and an active built environment. And so these factors can contribute to the growth in chronic conditions, such as obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And we've seen some interesting and alarming studies about how your zip code can help to explain your different health outcomes. For example, people living only 6 miles apart in Dallas have a life expectancy that can differ as much as 18 years, or the people on the east side versus the west side of Louisville have life expectancies that differ as much as 15 years. So it's really dramatic that our local environment and the conditions of our life affect our lifespan. Another topic under the social category is equity, diversity, and inclusion. The U.S. Census projects that starting this year in 2020, white non-Hispanic children will now be less than 50% of the total child population in the U.S. And by 2042, the U.S. population as a whole will be a majority minority population. And So we're seeing that and experiencing that in our communities, just with an increasingly diverse composition of people. This trend is playing out against a backdrop of continuing racial tension and growing income inequality. And you see on the chart on the lower left, upper income Americans, income and share of the aggregate wealth in this country grew by more than 30% over the last 30 years, with a commensurate decline in the share for lower and middle income residents of this country. So, growing wealth gap is a concerning trend. But we're also seeing changing attitudes in the younger generations who are growing up in a more diverse world. And so this will continue to be an important issue for our communities moving forward as we all live together and work and play together. And then the fourth topic under the social category is immigration. And once again, we turn to the census that who projects that by 2028, the foreign-born share of the U.S. population will be higher than at any time since 1850. And in 2030, immigration is expected to overtake natural increase as the largest contributor to the U.S. To the growth in U.S. population. So we have long been a nation of immigrants, and that continues to be true. And, you know, as David mentioned, one of the things we've been trying to do is look at interrelationships amongst the different issues that we'll be going through. And one example is that the U.S. is projected to need an additional 1 million elder care workers by 2025 in order to tend to our aging population. And this currently is a workforce that's comprised in large part by immigrants. So they have an important role to play in the years ahead in helping to take care of our aging population. And with that, I'll turn it back to David. David?
Okay, thanks, Ben. I'm going to go through the 4 technological drivers of change we've identified to focus on today. So the first is artificial intelligence. And in short and brief terms, what this involves is exponential increases in computing power and the proliferation of big data, which is enabling businesses, organizations, and governments to recognize patterns and predict future outcomes and base decisions on those. So artificial intelligence underpins other drivers of change, such as autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and automation. It's a broad it's really a broad force in today's society and economy, and will be more so moving forward. A lot of attention has been paid to the potential, I'll call it, of AI for deep learning, which means imitating the human brain in processing data and creating patterns for use in decision making. However, AI is still relatively early in its development. And the reality is it's been more effective to date in applying computing power to tasks such as number crunching, not so much starting to emulate human intelligence yet. Nevertheless, it's yielding benefits in industries like healthcare and transportation. At the same time, it's raising concerns around things like cybersecurity, privacy, and discrimination through algorithmic bias. And this actually raises another theme you'll be hearing us touch on as we move through. Is there positives and negatives associated with all these trends? So they could be good, they could be really serious and negative in their impacts, and that's part of what communities need to think about as we navigate the change. The second technological driver is related to artificial intelligence is autonomous vehicles. And this is a future driver of change, not here yet. That's become well known to planners over the last several years at least. And while the time frame is uncertain, when AVs do arrive, they're expected to have widespread impacts on the built environment of cities. For example, reduced parking demand, narrower right-of-ways, and freeing up land for redevelopment. And several factors will drive whether these outcomes are positive, negative, or a combination of both. And I've listed these here, but you know, they are whether Ownership moves from a mostly private ownership, as we have now, to fleets of cars, whether the rides themselves are shared or single occupancy, whether they're electric or fossil fuel powered. And then the driving force in the market could be whether shared rides become so cheap, convenient, and comfortable, they become the mode of choice. Autonomous vehicles is related to the next driver, which is new mobility. The AVs are somewhere off in the future, but new mobility, which is on-demand transportation services made possible by mobile technology, is disrupting established transportation systems and practices now in cities. So you see this disruption and increased congestion and demand for right-of-way and curb drop-off space by the transportation network companies. And you also see that our existing regulatory approaches, our permitting structures, our design standards aren't set up to accommodate these new forms of transportation. And like AVs, the jury is out now as to whether these outcomes will ultimately be positive or negative. For example, will e-scooters result in fewer auto trips, or will they substitute for active transportation trips like walking and biking? Will these new mobility options improve accessibility for poor and underserved populations, or accentuate the digital divide? Open questions at this point. The final driver we've identified under these topics is another well-established, well-known concept, smart cities. Now, the Smart Cities Council's definition of a smart city is a city that has digital technology embedded across all of its functions, and they emphasize the purpose, which is the goal is to improve livability, workability, and sustainability. There was a recent survey done by ESI Thought Lab, and they surveyed 100 cities worldwide in terms of sustainability benefits, who reported improved performance in 8 areas: public transit, traffic management, water, waste collection, and the environment, energy and electricity, public safety, and public health. So there are benefits that are being realized, and it can be and can be further realized, but there are also concerns regarding who controls, who has access to the digital data, and again, issues related to cybersecurity, privacy, and equity. And finally, there's an important question for local communities, which is how the necessary investments in digital technology and infrastructure needed to support it will be funded. So who's going to pay for what's needed to bring cities along and communities along to using smart cities, again, to achieve and improve livability, workability, and sustainability. So I'll turn it back over to Ben to go through the next set, which is the economic drivers.
Okay, our first economic driver is automation. And automation is, of course, the replacement of human labor with machines. And according to a 2019 report by the McKinsey Global Institute, the next wave of automation is anticipated to displace a number of professions, jobs in a number of professions, including food service, office support, transportation, logistics, and customer service jobs. So those occupations are at higher risk. At the same time, the economy is expected to continue to grow in the healthcare sector, the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math sector, and the business services jobs, as well as in jobs that require personal interaction. David had mentioned that artificial intelligence still is working on trying to match human cognitive capabilities. We also, human interaction is so important for many professions, including ours at times. And so this is going to continue to be a place where we have a competitive advantage against machines. One of the things this McKinsey Global Institute report documented was that our economies across the country sort of fall into a mosaic with different sort of combinations of skills and occupations and assets. And that a lot of growth is focused in 25 megacities and high growth hubs, which are projected to capture 60% of US job growth through 2030. So automation is a force, a driver of change that will affect different places in different ways. And so we really need to do some thoughtful strategizing to intervene and manage this force appropriately. Another force that we're seeing, of course, is e-commerce. This is an activity that's grown from 5% to 16% of total retail sales over the past 12 years as people tap the convenience of shopping online. Of course, this has reduced demand to some degree for bricks and mortar retail. However, at the same time, recent studies have found that there's increasing demand and market success for experiential retail. This does not mean the death of bricks and mortar. Communities and businesses are adapting. We are also seeing, of course, the expansion of other elements of infrastructure to support the delivery of online purchases. So warehousing and distribution are growing, as are freight and package delivery, which create issues that we need to address on the local level as we see more delivery vans on local streets and the like. Another force is the sharing economy. This, of course, uses digital technologies to match buyers and sellers and tap idle capacity, whether it's for our cars or our homes if we have them. So this can deliver cost savings for consumers, new revenue streams for owner leasers, and also provide more options, marketplace options for consumers. So there's some advantages, and there are also some challenges, of course. We are finding that these technologies are disrupting the traditional regulatory structures, whether it's an Uber driver who doesn't have to purchase a taxi medallion that might cost tens of thousands of dollars in a city, and instead is able to deliver a cheaper service as a result. Or an Airbnb that may not be, or a short-term rental that may not be paying the local sales tax, and so is able perhaps to deliver a more competitive product. So those are issues that communities are wrestling with, that the providers of these companies are wrestling with. One thing that should be noted too on this topic is that this kind of sharing has long been something that local government has done through activities such as leasing a public park facility temporarily for a private wedding to bring in more revenue and make that service available for special activities. And then finally, under the economic category, as we find new ways of exchanging goods and services, we are finding also that there's increasing interest in folks being able to use their individual or organizational purchasing power to help advance important social goods and activities, trying to purchase environmentally and socially responsible products, and companies that commit to treating their employees well and treating the natural environment well. And so, of course, at the same time that we're more familiar with the sharing economy, we also have the circular and subscription economies. The circular economy being a commitment to promoting reuse and eliminating waste, and the subscription economy, where people buy a share in something and get a share of the produce. So, for example, this is a model that's used with community-supported agriculture to help provide a more reliable source of income for producers and help consumers to receive fresh local products. So that's a wrap on that section, and now turn it back to David.
Thanks, Ben, again. And I'm going to go through our last set of drivers of change, which are environmental drivers, starting with climate change. And I believe the poll identified that as the #1 issue. Am I incorrect in that? And let's not poll the audience. I think climate change was first. And thinking of it, climate change obviously is an existential threat. That's what we think of it as. And I like to think about the impacts of climate change using the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program as a lens. The idea of acute shocks, such as extreme weather events, and then chronic stresses that weaken the community over time, such as sea level rise, associated nuisance flooding, and the urban heat island effect. From an equity perspective, people and communities are differentially exposed to hazards and disproportionately affected by climate-related health risks. So the most vulnerable populations include low-income communities, communities of color, children, and older adults. I wanted to say a word on climate change mitigation versus adaptation. Mitigation addresses the causes of climate change and requires action at the global scale to draw down carbon levels, but adaptation addresses the impact of climate change at the community scale. And by the way, tree planting is a particularly effective, in my mind, climate change strategy because it accomplishes both mitigation and adaptation. And the final point I'd like to make on climate change is that the adaptation strategies need to be tailored to the need of each community because communities have different vulnerabilities and risks. So moving on to the next, changing energy sources. The market shift we're seeing now is essential to successfully mitigating climate change. In 2019, the US energy sources for electrical generation were 62.7% fossil fuels, 19.7% nuclear, and 17.5% renewables. And renewable sources have, as we all know, have become cost competitive and are rapidly increasing their market share. But the question is, how long will it take them to replace other sources? So implications for local communities include investments in technology that are needed, smart meters, for example, infrastructure, for example, electric vehicle charging strategies needed to support and sustain this ongoing shift. There are also land use and regulatory implications. For example, the need to recognize large-scale solar installations as a unique land use in zoning ordinances. The next driver is natural resource depletion. And now this is a global trend driven by population growth, consumer product demand, and also basic human needs, such as the need for food and water. And we can see its effects in water shortages and inequitable access to safe drinking water, the impact of raw material extraction, like strip coal mining, for example, on the landscape and on water supplies, and in unsustainable farming and fishing practices. So local responses, communities at the local level can reduce consumption, increase recycling and renewable energy use, and conserve and restore natural ecosystems. So that brings us to the last of the 16 drivers of change, globalization. And it's perhaps the most, I think it's the most cross-cutting of them all. We have a global economy in which goods are shipped around the world and depend on just-in-time supply chains that span multiple countries. And this current pandemic is an indication of how easily these interdependencies can be disrupted. We're globally connected via information and communications technology. That's a good thing at the current time, but just imagine what would happen if the internet suddenly stopped working. And the final point I'd like to make, and this relates to the environment, is that COVID-19 is nothing new. We've been experiencing the global spread of pests like emerald ash borer, just one example, invasive plants down south, kudzu, and pandemics like the Spanish influenza for at least the last century. This middle image, I don't know if anyone recognizes it, but it's the spotted lanternfly, which is an insect that was imported from Asia that's now infesting trees, plants, and farms in southeast Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I live. And I first became aware of this pest last summer when it seemed to come out of nowhere, though apparently it's been around since 2014. And it was the big local news story. And when you think about it, COVID-19 is similar to the spotted lanternfly, except that the stakes are so much higher because it's humans rather than plants that are at risk. So let's move to the next slide, Ben, and I'd like to conclude this overview, now that we've brought up COVID-19, to think about the current pandemic, which is a product of globalization, how it cuts across drivers of change. We've been saying these are all interconnected. So for example, immigration, the actions by governments to close down borders for public health reasons echo similar efforts related to immigration in recent years and could cause more action along those lines in the future. Next. Assume this driver is an Uber driver. If so, he's the happiest one I've ever seen. But consider in this context that Uber and Lyft are discontinuing pooled rides right now, shared rides, because of coronavirus concerns. So is this pointing towards the future of single rides and autonomous vehicles? We're all sealed up in our own cars instead of the shared ride, shared fleet model that we needed to promote sustainable outcomes, as I touched on earlier. And the next one is e-commerce. We've obviously seen a massive increase in e-commerce. My wife and I, like many others, we never ordered groceries online before, and now we're having everything delivered. Though I must say, I much prefer shopping in stores. Nonetheless, there's a great impetus being given from COVID-19 to e-commerce. And finally, the virus is reinforcing change in our social and community interactions and in the technology we use. So will our future be one of the virtual rather than community meetings? And if so, how can we ensure access for all segments of the community? So that concludes our scan of social, technological, economic, and environmental drivers of change. In this next part of our presentation, we're going to take a couple of places and explore how they may play out in different contexts, because they are going to play out very differently in different communities. So we've picked Austin, which is a growing Sunbelt city, and Cleveland, which is a legacy city that has experienced major population decline from its peak. So I'm going to start with Austin, and then Ben's going to do Cleveland. So Austin's a growing city of close to 1 million people, known as the live music capital of the world for its high-tech industry, creative economy. And the US News and World Report ranked it as the #1 place to live in the US for 2017 and 2018. So we're going to go through again quickly through the 4 categories of social drivers. So considering, drivers of change. So considering the social drivers that Ben covered earlier, the city's younger than the national average, high percentage of the population in the 25 to 44 year range. Conversely, the percentage of residents 65 years and over is about 1/2 of the national average, meaning that Austin has a larger working age population relative to the number of retirees. And Austin's also more diverse than the national average, more foreign-born residents than the average by about 4 points. And the proportion of non-Hispanic whites is less than 50%. And what this means is that the city has achieved majority minority status decades earlier than is projected for the nation as a whole. And this change is being driven not by a decrease in the white population, but by increases in the Asian and particularly Hispanic shares of the population. So Austin, I think, has a lot going for it from a population diversity standpoint. This is contributing to the dynamism of the economy and its attractiveness as a place to live. And so it's not surprising that, given its reputation as a center of high tech, it's also at the forefront of the technological drivers and of change. So just a couple of examples. There's a smart city cross-sectoral collaboration across companies, organizations, government, and individuals looking to advance smart city techniques. And there's also a strong artificial intelligence base. These are just 2 shown on the screen, 2 of 69 artificial intelligence companies in the city. Which brings us to economic drivers. Top employment sectors for Austin residents are professional, as you can see, professional, scientific, technical services, educational services, and healthcare and social assistance. Manufacturing is relatively low and actually ranks below the next 2, which are accommodation and food service and retail trade. But however, moving on, even a city with a dynamic economy like Austin is not immune to the potentially negative effects of the drivers of change. So I was surprised to find this. This was a recent study that found that 29% of the city's jobs are at risk from automation, which makes it the 13th most vulnerable metro area in the country. So the most vulnerable occupations are retail salespersons, food preparation and servers, office clerks, waiters, waitresses, and cashiers. By the way, some of the same people that are being put out of work by the current pandemic. And moving on to environmental drivers, Austin also has serious issues, including extreme heat, drought, flooding from climate change, concerns about the long-term sustainability of its water supply. They have and are taking steps to address these issues. For example, Water Forward, which is an innovative 100-year plan for water security. Just came with development in the last couple of years. But I want to conclude this series of slides on Austin by raising a question not just for Austin, but for all communities I think need to answer, which is what are the implications of these drivers of change for what makes Austin and other communities a special place? In the case of Austin, there's culture, creativity, and community spirit. How can these qualities be sustained in the face of challenges like extreme heat? 27 out of 31 days in August of last year had highs of 100 degrees or more, and new threats like COVID-19. Now, knowing Austin as I do, I wouldn't bet against the city being able to figure it out. I'll turn it over now to Ben, who's going to talk about Cleveland.
Great, thanks, David. So let's now go to a legacy city, Cleveland, located at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River on Lake Erie. Cleveland was bursting at the seams in the years after World War II, and the city's population peaked at around 900,000 in 1950. What we've got on the top is a graph showing the population of Cuyahoga County in red. That's the county that includes Cleveland, then Cleveland in blue, and then the surrounding counties below. And you can see from 1950 to the present, there's been continued decline in the population. The regional population, however, has been stable, so it's sort of sprawl without growth and an outmigration from the center city. I also have displayed some basic demographic information. In this case, I've used the information from the Metropolitan Statistical Area for Cleveland. Still an older population than Austin, whiter population as well. Now, it's not surprising in a scenario of sprawl without growth that over time there are fewer people per developed acre, and you see almost a 25% decline from 1979 to 2006 in Northeast Ohio in the number of people per developed acre. Now, the city, as mentioned, this is a phenomenon that the Cuyahoga County has been experiencing as well. So it's a phenomenon that's affected both the city and also the inner ring suburbs. And so they've been responding. And there's been a lot of effort to invest in the city, both with things like sports arenas and cultural institutions, like the Great Lakes Museum, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the relocation of the arena for the Cavaliers to downtown Cleveland, and also by other more recent efforts like this wonderful undertaking to revitalize and redesign the public square, the center of Cleveland, first laid out by Moses Cleveland at the end of the 18th century, to make that a more inviting and dynamic center for the city and the region. And so these investment efforts are having a positive impact. This last chart is a chart of the downtown population, folks living in the downtown. And so that has been steadily increasing in recent years and brought more vitality and more resources to the center city. And then, but at the same time, there are also continuing challenges with displacement. And so Cleveland is experiencing that to some degree as well. Cleveland's economy was born in manufacturing, dating back to John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil of Ohio, centered around the Cuyahoga River, the mouth of the Cuyahoga, and then the emergence of the steel industry and with the ability to tap iron ore brought from the upper Great Lakes and then to take the finished steel products and also ship those by boat or by rail. But one thing that's important to note that is a real asset for Cleveland continuing into the present is its healthcare industry. Of course, Cleveland is home to the Cleveland Clinic, a world-renowned hospital, as well as many other medical institutions. And so you see healthcare and manufacturing are the top two industry sectors. Manufacturing, Cleveland was hit hard during the recession, losing close to 200,000 manufacturing jobs, but it has been slowly recovering in that sector, really focusing more on nimble, smaller manufacturing as well. And so that's part of the strategy then for Cleveland to develop and enhance its economy in the years ahead has been to focus on innovation, like so many places, and build off of its core assets. So the Cleveland Clinic has a whole medical innovations program to develop new medical technologies and instruments and medicines. Again, there are a panoply of different medical institutions. Here's a sampling of just a few that are located in and around the clinic and university hospitals in Cleveland. And Cleveland also has worked to leverage its educational institutions, Cleveland State University, Case Western Reserve University, and Cuyahoga Community College to help spark innovation and support business development. And then finally, looking at the environmental driver, the Mid-Cleveland, like the Midwest, is slated to be hit hard by climate change. The fourth National Climate Assessment takes a look at some of the key challenges in this region of the country, including increasing water temperatures that will continue to stress fish populations. Also, increasing hot days will bring more ground level ozone and more premature ozone related deaths. So those are some of the challenges. Also, increased flooding. This is a challenge Cleveland with an older infrastructure has been facing. It's got combined sewers. So when it rains, the storm sewers overburden the sanitary sewer system, and untreated sewage flows into rivers and into the lake. But the Northeast Ohio Sewer District has been working very hard to capture that first flush in giant underground vaults and then slowly release it to treatment plants. And Cleveland also is benefiting from a green infrastructure investment made in the early years of the 20th century when it created its own emerald necklace circling Cleveland. And so the city has grown out and past that emerald necklace, but it helps to provide an essential green infrastructure and protect it, both as a recreational resource and also to help provide ecosystem services, sort of mitigating flooding impacts and heat island impacts and the like. Cleveland also has invested heavily in transit. And in addition to having light rail and heavy rail, it also has perhaps one of the most successful bus rapid transit systems, certainly in the country, the Health Line connecting downtown to the University Circle area. So Cleveland has both challenges and opportunities in the years ahead as it works to address the spectrum of different drivers of change. So now we're on to our third and final section. And the big challenge, of course, for participants in the webinar, as for David and myself, is how do we help our communities prepare for these forces that we see coming, and some of which are starting to arrive. And so we've got another audience flash poll question for you here. And so we'd like to know, how prepared do you think your community is to handle emerging issues? We've got 4 options. A, not prepared, B, somewhat prepared, C, very prepared, and D, unsure. So we'll give you a minute to log your answers, and then we'll take a look as a group at what everyone has said.
So the second choice on this will be somewhat prepared. I think it says not prepared on the slide.
Let's see. Well, we've got A, not prepared, B, somewhat prepared, C, very prepared, D, unsure.
Yeah, Ben, it's slightly different on our poll that's on the screen, just for everybody
Oh,
in the
okay. I'm
audience.
sorry. Very good.
Okay, so the answers that we have here then are 61% somewhat prepared, 17 not prepared, 18% unsure, and only 4% very prepared.
And this is the point in the webinar where we turn the program over to the very prepared people.
Yeah, I want to know who those very prepared people are.
Yeah,
Learn some lessons.
we'd love to follow up with you and help you share your experiences. What David and I are going to do is share some experiences from other places that have started to wrestle with these drivers of change. I'll go through a few, and then David will go through a few. One interesting example is work that's been done by New York City. Now, many of us have heard of chief technology officers. New York City has created a chief algorithm management and policy officer to help the different departments in the city with the algorithms that they're increasingly using to help promote efficiency and service provision. But there's also another function that this officer has, and that is to promote equity, fairness, and accountability. When you've got these complex algorithms, it's hard to, they're not always necessarily the most transparent things. And so that is one of the expressed roles of this position, is to help ensure transparency and fairness in the use of these techniques. We also have a nice example of a smart city action plan developed by Chula Vista, California. They've been working hard through a very inclusive community process to define goals for how they should pursue smart city technology. They established 4 of them to create a city that's connected, responsive, transparent, and innovative. And then they've been working to identify existing measures and new measures to help the city systematically make progress toward achieving those goals, drawing on the potential of smart cities. We've got a couple of examples of communities that have done some really interesting work on climate change. One is here in North Carolina, where I'm located, out in the mountains of North Carolina in Asheville. Asheville recently went through a process to develop a new comprehensive plan. And one of the elements of the plan was to do a special assessment on climate resilience. And so they convened, in their case, a team of city experts to look at working with the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center based in Asheville to look at the different climate-related challenges and how they might impact the city and region of Asheville. And so they then mapped those different challenges, developed metrics to assess their relative impact as best they could, given the changing nature of this force, and then developed a whole series of implementation strategies, which they prioritized to make systematic progress over time in helping do their local part and to be more resilient and reduce their contribution to climate change. We also have an example from Norfolk, Virginia. Shout out to George Homewood, the planning director for Norfolk. And George and his team developed a Norfolk Vision 2100 a few years back, looking at the different places in the city and what they might be like and what they might be experiencing in the year 2100. This is a question that's always interested me, you know, as we do planning work and development code work in communities. we're faced with the challenge of potentially locating new development in areas that might be flooded or underwater in 30, 50, 100 years. And so Norfolk has taken on that challenge directly and tried to identify areas that where adaptation's important and that need to, or areas where that are so important from an economic standpoint that they need to be armored. And then other areas that are on higher ground that are appropriately located to receive new development. And so they then work to align some of the different implementation tools like their development standards to help direct development to these lower risk, more sustainable locations and more resilient locations. And then sort of continuing the theme that David has really highlighted about the cross-cutting nature of these issues, my third example combines equity, health, and other drivers of change. And it's an example from Cleveland, the Evergreen Cooperatives. And this is a nonprofit organization that's developed cooperative businesses that are focused on creating jobs, building wealth, and empowering residents in the lower income neighborhoods in and around University Circle and the Cleveland Clinic on the east side of Cleveland. And so the clinic has been a major partner in this effort. And they've created 2 laundries, one of which does all the laundering for the clinic, as well as a hydroponic greenhouse. And now they're looking at other businesses as well. And an important thing to note is this is a cooperative. They've employed about 200 people already in these businesses from the surrounding neighborhoods. And after the folks are there for a year, they have a chance to become members and obtain a share in the ownership of the businesses. So really an interesting wealth building and empowerment model from the city of Cleveland. Now turning it back over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I've got a few more. And again, these are just selected examples. There are many out there, but these are a few we thought were worth highlighting of kind of leading practices now that different communities are using. And I have a couple here on the screen. They're addressing immigration. Baltimore, Maryland's a legacy city like Cleveland's lost population. So a few years ago, they established a New Americans Task Force that developed recommendations to enhance economic growth and community well-being by retaining and attracting immigrants to the city. Parks for New Portlanders is a program initiated by the Portland Parks and Recreation Department to provide recreation opportunities for immigrant and refugee communities. So what this program does is to make sure that services and spaces are welcoming and accessible to communities of color, new immigrants and refugees. Really the role of parks as a place of coming together for the community. And the Parks Department hired a new American. I saw him speak at a conference a couple of years ago to manage this program. The next example sort of spans new mobility and autonomous vehicles. I'm returning to the city of Austin, where automobile dependency is a major environmental equity and quality of life issue. 74% of residents drive alone to work. So what the city's done is they developed a strategic mobility plan to move more towards a multimodal transportation system and shared mobility options using, it's a new concept of new mobility, data and emerging technology to connect public transit, shared and on-demand mobility services in an equitable manner is a key part of the plan. On the right of the screen is Chandler, Arizona, which was the first jurisdiction to address autonomous vehicles and ride sharing in the zoning ordinance. They have parking reductions and standards for passenger pickup and drop off areas. And an interesting aspect of this is because it's impossible to predict with certainty how reduced parking demand will play out over time as AVs presumably will be deployed, the ordinance allows flexibility to adjust parking ratio as transportation behavior evolves. Now I'm going to end this series. Again, we're going to return back to COVID-19 because as I said earlier, it spans a lot of really all the different drivers of change. So This is an emerging practice, a new practice. Esri has established a COVID-19 GIS hub with resources to help communities and organizations understand, prepare for, and respond to COVID-19. It's on their website, and a lot of communities are taking advantage of this, including my home county, which is Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, which has its own local COVID-19 GIS hub. That's shown at the bottom of the screen. And I actually live in Lower Marion Township. You can see that's a dark green square down at the bottom, which had the first recorded COVID-19 case in Pennsylvania and continues to have the highest number in the county. Now, Esri's resources include this 5-step process. It's at the top to help communities address COVID-19. I'd like to draw your attention particularly to step 3, map vulnerable populations. And we've all heard that the elderly and people with underlying health conditions are the most vulnerable, but I think there's a deeper question at play here, is what makes an overall population vulnerable? And that brings us back to the social determinants of health that Ben talked about earlier. And these determinants influence overall community resilience to withstand and bounce back from acute shocks like natural disasters and COVID-19. So by addressing the social determinants, for example, economic stability, built environment, access to healthy foods, planners can help increase community resiliency before an acute shock strikes, and other professionals contribute as well. Of course, it would help to have a pandemic preparedness plan in place, which hopefully many communities will develop now as part of their emergency preparedness plan after COVID-19 passes. I'm going to turn it back to Ben, who's going to wrap up our presentation.
Thanks, David. So David and I, in thinking about what we can do at a community level, have developed a 3-step methodology. And so I'm going to walk through each step here and talk through some of just the key elements of it. Something for you to consider for your community. Step 1 is what we're calling an emerging trends orientation. This would include sort of a similar scan of the drivers of change, like what David and I have provided. And then really trying to think about how to apply that appropriately to your community, which issues are most applicable, and then trying to hone in and target those top drivers. And so this is a process that could be richly participatory with stakeholder involvement, as well as with people in your organization. The next step that we've identified is preparing a community resilience assessment. Here, we're really trying to document community goals and assets and vulnerabilities, and then look at threats and opportunities posed by each of the key drivers. And then, of course, to try and prioritize those, since we'll always be working in a resource-constrained environment. We're also, in this step, looking to assess the institutional capabilities and barriers to responding to these different drivers, so that we have a good sense of where we're vulnerable and what our current ability is to respond. And then the third step is something we're describing as a community readiness plan, working to identify special projects that will really help to address these threats and maximize the opportunities that we have in the years ahead. And then at the same time, we know in many cases, our organizations are really going to need to evolve in order to become more nimble. And so identifying policies, procedures, and programs that help increase our agility and ability to respond will be so important. I think this is a particular challenge when we're planning in the face of uncertainty, like we are with many of these issues. And even if an issue feels like it's maybe decades away, like autonomous vehicles in terms of being a major force in our communities, we are starting to see the early signs of it. For example, when considering new parking decks in a downtown environment and considering the financing period for those decks, which often span several decades, we start to get into the time frame when autonomous vehicles might really affect begin to affect parking demand in a downtown environment. So thinking about how to create teams in our organization to collaborate across departments and across functions to track these issues, understand them, and take appropriate action as it makes sense moving forward. And then the final aspect of the community readiness plan is to establish a structure for monitoring, tracking, implementation, and as we work to advance readiness in a systematic way, and to also monitor continuing changes in these drivers of change, and then to adjust accordingly over time to help optimize our response and sort of help our community be the most successful as it can be in the years ahead. So that concludes David and my presentation. We have posted a PDF of our presentation on our website, proact-now.com, so you can go there and download a copy. David and I would welcome the opportunity to talk with you if you want to talk more about these issues and how they might apply to your community. And we'll also open the program up for question and answer. And with that, I'll turn it back to Michael. Michael? So we're going to share our webcams here. Let's see. And hopefully David and I are visible. And we'll now start taking questions, and we're going to invite Michael to read the questions for us.
And thank you both. And so just to remind everybody that throughout the webinar, we've been assembling the questions from the audience, and we're not going to move into that.
More established cities that maybe have experienced a peak in their population and now are starting to experience decline. Quite a contrast from many Sunbelt cities that are sort of bursting at the seams and growing out rapidly. David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that they're not necessarily experiencing decline now. They've experienced severe decline, but we're seeing some growth back. For example, Philadelphia is increasing in population. So as we have a new economy come into place, there are new opportunities for cities like Cleveland and Baltimore, et cetera. But yes, they have in the past experienced severe decline, largely due to loss of their manufacturing base.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to follow up with another kind of definitional question. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between mitigation and adaptation?
Sure, I can take that one. Mitigation are actions to address the cause of climate change, and the major human contribution to climate change is fossil fuel emissions. So it's action to reduce the amount of the fossil fuel emissions and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Adaptation is a local response to climate change. So it's what you do to adapt. For example, I mentioned trees. The reason trees are a good adaptation strategy is they ameliorate the urban heat island effect, and they also provide stormwater management benefits, green stormwater management. But they're also contribute to mitigation because they sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So there's actually now a 1 trillion tree planting initiative that's global, and President Trump has signed on to.
Okay, a couple questions about the planning, kind of comp planning aspects of this. As local governments update their comprehensive plans, what are your thoughts on how they should integrate these drivers into their analysis and recommend
share different drivers of change, get input from stakeholders on what folks think are the most relevant for their community, and have a whole conversation about that. And then incorporate the themes and goals that come out of those discussions into the goals of the larger plan. David, do you
Yeah,
want
I
to
can
add?
add to that. That's a great question, and we've been thinking about this. And there's definitely a role for this in the comprehensive planning process. But even beyond that, when you think about all aspects of planning and implementation, APA developed this model called the 5 strategic points of intervention that go from community visioning and goal setting to comprehensive planning to development of plans like functional plans, area plans, and then implementation through regulations, development review approval, public investment. Think about these drivers of change and all of these different components of planning, all these aspects of planning, but also think about, these drivers of change are happening, but what's really important is the vision and values of the community. So how can we work with these to minimize adverse impacts, to bring the benefits of technology to support the community's vision and what the community says that they'd like to be looking towards the future. And I'll say one more thing. I've talked a little long on this, but it's an important point, is that it's a time of uncertainty. We brought that up. So that vision isn't this like end state that's out there that we're going towards. It's uncertain how we're going to reach it and how these drivers of change will play out. So scenario planning is very important in this, and flexibility, agility, and adaptation at the community level over time as these changes play out.
Thanks, David. And I'll mention just to the audience that we actually have in our archives a webinar about scenario planning in case anybody's interested in looking at that. Here's a follow-up, kind of based on what you were just saying, although it wasn't directly from it, it was submitted earlier. You provided some examples of comprehensive plans. How can municipalities address drivers such as technological advances in their plans from a policy perspective while keeping it broad and flexible?
That's a good question. Obviously, there's a lot of examples of communities that are doing this. I'm thinking particularly in the areas of new mobility and autonomous vehicles, strategic places like Austin that set sort of policy directions, but then the challenge is how you adapt over time as these forces play out. And the Chandler example I mentioned was one where they incorporated flexibility to adjust the parking standards over time. And I know there are developers that are looking at this, building perhaps not having to build the total amount of parking out and wait to see what the parking demand is over time. It's just going to take a different approach to how we think about standards, development, regulations, and plans. I don't know if, Ben, you have anything to add to that.
Yeah. I mean, again, a good question, and one that some of the examples that David and I looked at were addressed. So, for example, this Smart City Strategic Action Plan developed by Chula Vista, California, they're very open about saying, we've made an initial effort to develop, to identify what we care about in terms of a value system related to this issue. We've identified initial implementation strategies, but we really view our strategic action plan as a living document. And I mean, that's certainly true with the comp plan. We revisit the comp plan, hopefully at least every 5 years if it's a community that's experiencing significant change. Ideally, we have an annual check-in to see what kind of progress we're making on implementation. But even those frameworks, I think, David and I have felt maybe are not as nimble as they could be. And so we're starting to see some of more flexible formats and structures make their way into comprehensive planning. For example, with the use of online dashboards and plans that are entirely presented online. So a good colleague of ours, Wendy Moeller in Ohio, was the consultant on a project for Hamilton, Ohio, to post their plan entirely online. That's a document that is maybe can be updated more easily as issues change and priorities change. Kauai County, Hawaii, for example, has an online dashboard to help residents access plan materials and track implementation. So we're starting to see people wrestle with that issue. I definitely think our institutions and our organizations need to think hard about how to make themselves more flexible, because it's almost like things are changing faster than our institutions and organizations can react, and so that is again a primary motivation for David and myself in delving into this issue and developing a methodology to try and help folks become more prepared.
Okay. I think you mentioned the term new mobility again, and but we actually got a question if you could talk a little bit more about what that means.
Okay, new mobility is basically the unifying structure is mobile technology. And of course, so it opens up lots of choices for you as alternatives to just jumping in your car and driving somewhere. But of course, there's access issues, for example, for people who don't have access to technology that need to be dealt with. But the progressive transit agencies are looking at new mobility and looking at what the private companies are doing and looking for ways to partner and enter into this market, because the by mobile technology.
Okay. Next question, how are you looking at incorporating urban data analytics, especially around big data and algorithms, to inform this work?
I think it's extremely helpful, and tapping resources like Urban Footprint or the resources that ESRI has and others can help communities sort of figure out understand the implications of some of these forces in their particular context. And so it's just, I think it's been a wonderful evolution in the ready access to geographic specific information online, and it really helps facilitate this work and get a customized view for your community.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it's promises to or it could realize the promise that we've been, planners have been looking for years, which is sort of real-time analytics in public meetings, for example, and scenario planning, so citizens, participants can generate scenarios and get the number crunching done, the analytics done to see what the results are, outcomes in terms of sustainability and other performance indicators. That's something Esri has been working on, I know. So it's opening up a whole lot of new possibilities, crowdsourcing, all sorts of different things.
Okay, thanks, David. So I will mention that we have gotten several questions about the pandemic and COVID-19. I'm going to hold off those till after we have some more general questions. And then maybe David and Ben, if you're able to go on a few extra minutes, we can spend some time near the end kind of tackling those, if that works for you.
Sure.
Sounds good.
Okay. I guess another kind of a follow-up question to what we're talking about. In regards to scooters and bike questions is, how will our streets be changed to accommodate these new types of transportation?
I think there are opportunities to fundamentally redesign and rethink how space is allocated within right-of-ways. the issue with e-scooters, I remember a couple of summers ago when all of a sudden they were everywhere. I was visiting several cities and they came out of nowhere, and there seemed to be no control. They'd be on sidewalks, they'd be in the streets, and there were conflicts with pedestrians. And for example, for autonomous vehicles, there's been work done in terms of like visualizing, well, you're going to have a right of way. Autonomous vehicles require less space, so that's going to open up space for wider sidewalks, for bike lanes, for whatever. So there's some promise there, but I think it's just I'm not going to offer any specific examples here, but I think this is an opportunity for urban designers, landscape architects, others to really come up with the kind of design solutions that can address this. And I'll actually say one other thing, because I think the technology that we have can create opportunities for more flexible use of our streets, so they're not always like painted lanes at all times of the day. Maybe the number of, and I know there are bridges that do this, but maybe the number of lanes can change, and you can go depending on what the predominant traffic flow is, and then you can create space to accommodate some of these other modes as well within that. But there is definitely competition for street space now being generated by all these things.
I want to add that that's a great point, David. And I want to add, this is an important area of an opportunity for cooperation between local government, state DOTs, private service providers, to really get a sort of coordinate well with each other, think through what makes sense, and try and create lasting frameworks. Now, one of the challenges, of course, with autonomous vehicles is that there will probably be a period of many years where we're in a mixed environment, where we have conventional vehicles and autonomous vehicles at the same time. And so trying to accommodate both of those in a sort of a transition phase to a future that maybe looks different in terms of right-of-way space allocation is going to stress our regulatory frameworks, our institutional ownership and management frameworks. And so starting to build the collaborative efforts and teams across organizations and across disciplines will be really important. So this is just one of many examples in that regard. If we're going to realize the full potential and service to our communities.
Okay. Based on the changes in our social makeup, what thought do you have in how we should change our public outreach to ensure broad and full participation by the changing societal makeup?
And I can start and David, maybe, or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is something I think a lot about as part of our comp planning projects that we do. And, we're more and more, we're trying to use multiple platforms and also meet people wherever they are. So that might be going to meetings of their place of worship in their neighborhood or neighborhood meetings, and might also be meeting them online. We're also trying to deliver both meaningful engagement and also timely and convenient engagement. And so the use of quick flash polls for a sort of a busy tech worker might be one strategy. And then sitting down and meeting in small groups or one-on-one with someone in a neighborhood could be a different strategy. I think the key is to use a mix of techniques and really not force everyone to come to town hall. Instead, try and get out either virtually or in the community to wherever they are. David?
Yeah, and I agree with that. And it sort of recalls, in my experience a number of years ago, I was a consultant for the city of Austin on their Imagine Austin comp plan. And I remember the original round of community meetings didn't get a lot of folks out. So the city totally changed its engagement strategy and went out into the community. You need to go out where people are and use a variety of techniques. But actually, there's a point I want to bring in here related to perhaps to COVID-19 is, now you're going to see stuff moving online, and there are going to be online meetings, and there are very sophisticated ways of doing that. But how can you ensure that, communities that don't have access to the latest technology, that people will be involved and engaged. And I think that's an issue. We just don't know how that's going to play out right now. So I think we're going to be reinventing what we have been doing some good things over the years, as Ben has been saying, but we have a need to now reinvent and rethink how we're going to engage communities moving forward.
Okay, yeah, and we'll get to that a little bit more in a bit, but a couple more general questions. Can you talk more about circular and subscription economies and how they relate to planning and zoning?
There's sort of new ways and interesting ways of doing business, and also that have a key, certainly with circular economies and to some degree with subscription economies, have the notions of sustainability fundamentally integrated into them. So, I mean, and I think, like when I look at the dynamic of and the concepts of a circular economy, we're starting to talk about the level of change in our uh, behavior and practice that is probably going to be needed to really get a handle on these global forces like climate change. We need to be taking a lot more action than we are. Thinking about an economy that doesn't waste anything, where everything is reused in some way, starts to, well, I think will push us at the pace that we probably need to be pushed and collaborate to sort of match the scale of the problem. So then with subscription economies, those are not necessarily they don't necessarily have to include sustainability as a core principle. I just happen to think of them, when I think of community-supported agriculture, a wonderful linking of producers and consumers for the mutual benefit of both. But I mean, they can also be used to in more conventional ways in commerce. My wife had subscribed briefly to a program that sent her like what is it called? A Saks trunk, and you'd tell them what kind of clothes you like, and then every month they'd send you some samplings. If you liked some of them, you keep them. If not, you'd send the rest back. It was kind of a subscription thing. So we certainly have seen that with food, with people who send you prepared meals or all the ingredients plus a recipe, and you get that every week or every month. And so that's how I understand it. David, do you want to add more?
Just a word. That was an interesting question, how it relates to planning and zoning, because we think about that sharing economy, Airbnb, right? That's a huge zoning planning issue, but maybe, these are things where planning and zoning gets out of the way and doesn't create any regulatory barriers to make them happen because they're promoting sustainability outcomes. So maybe that's one way of thinking about it.
Okay. So I'm going to read a comment while I'm scrolling to it back here. We've gotten a lot of questions. Thank you, everybody in the audience. So this will be kind of a transition comment into some of the COVID questions. I don't have a question, but want to thank you for this presentation. Discussing all of these changes has helped me to understand my recent feeling of depression and helplessness. So many changes and happening so very fast, and there's a role for planners. At the beginning of my career, I always saw my role as a community communicator and educator. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a huge role and opportunity for the planning profession as leaders. And that's what, I've tried to think in this later stage of my career. I'm still very active, obviously, but how can we get the planning profession out front leading these changes? Because there's a need for us in the skills we bring. So think of the leadership opportunities that are out there to address these. The way we think, the way we work, our empathy for people, for communities, I think are skills that are really needed right now. Society needs us.
I would absolutely agree. And it certainly, we can relate to the overwhelming feeling of trying to confront this myriad of issues. And I think the thing that nothing makes me feel better about that than having a clear, productive course of action to take. And so that is one of the things David and I are trying to describe, is how communities can take positive action to prepare themselves so that you can put your time and energy to productive use in addressing the issues. So hopefully our presentation's been helpful. We know there will be many conversations that need to occur as we continue to wrestle with these issues.
Okay, so another question here. Given the worldwide pandemic hitting high density areas, will this bring a revival of rural areas and a rethinking of public transportation?
That's a really interesting question, and it could. I was just reading something maybe this morning, which was speculating that, the things that planners believe in, density, is density a good thing now with COVID-19? Transit systems are running empty, but I do want to say something about COVID-19. It's a crisis right now, but there's going to be eventually there's going to be a vaccine, and there's going to be treatment, and this was largely preventable if we were prepared ahead of time. And our APA's Hazard Mitigation Disaster Recovery Division has developed resources and a policy guide to address this. And I was serious when I said earlier, if a community had a pandemic, a preparedness plan in place, you'd know what to do, and ideally that would be in place at the state and the federal level. So how you control this is known. It's just that we were not prepared for this. But the long range ramifications, that's exactly the kind of thing I was talking about. It could lead to that. And maybe it's rural revival at the expense of urban areas. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's too early to know, but I also agree that the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the importance of acting quickly in an effective way, and you're only able to do that through preparation. It's hard to react to some of these forces, certainly this one. So it highlights that the importance, like David said, of planning ahead.
Okay. How can we make supply chains more resilient in the face of a changing world? In a world without pandemics or other challenges like these, it makes economic sense to concentrate industries in certain cities and regions, but that doesn't work so well if that city or region is completely shut down due to a pandemic or climate change. How do we get firms or industries to structure in a more resilient way?
Boy, that's a tough question. Do you have some thoughts about that, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, so two immediate thoughts, and again, this is something I'm sure we'd love to think about and talk about over a more extended period. My two initial thoughts are, one, the importance of redundancy. And so much of our traditional hazard mitigation response framework is predicated on the event being in a particular area and us being able to tap unused mitigation and capacity from other places. But here with the pandemic, it's affecting everyone's. Now there are still gradations of that, but there is less opportunity to flex capacity from less affected places. So redundancy is going to be important in the years ahead, and the notion of networks. So in the same way that the internet functions with all different routes for the pathway for communication, we need to continue to think in that way as we develop strategies for responding to these techniques. So if one pathway is shut down for whatever reason, there are alternative pathways to still get goods and services and expertise and personnel to the places that need them. So that's one thought, is the importance of redundancy. Second thought is this will probably, I imagine, add additional impetus to the localism movement and creating more self-sufficiency on a local level. My wife and I are deeply envious of our neighbor a couple doors down or the previous neighbor who installed solar panels and has a chicken coop and a garden and is well positioned to ride out some of the a dynamic such as this. And we just haven't invested in that, but increasingly, I think we'll be thinking about that not only as individuals, but also as neighborhoods, and helping each other on a neighborhood scale, as well as a community and a national scale.
Yeah, I was
David?
going to emphasize a reliance on local assets as an economic development strategy, and again, that may favor rural places. And I know EPA's Office of Economic Revitalization, which is helping sponsor this, has done a lot of work and gives technical assistance in that area.
Okay. To follow up on that, obviously the current COVID-19 issue is currently disrupting our normal work environment, particularly as it relates to teleworking and virtual interaction and engagement. Do you think this temporary response will have longer lasting implications on how we do business in the United States?
I definitely, we're both talking at once. I'll take the start. I definitely think it will. And I actually think some of this is long overdue. Because why do you have to fly everywhere for meetings and all the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions? You can do things very efficiently. We're finding, over the internet using programs like this. I've used about 4 or 5 different programs I'm teaching a course online. But I must say, teaching is not one of those that I think is ideal for that. But I do think it's going to change, and we're going to end up doing a lot more of this type of activity on a routine basis. And I think that's, largely a good thing. But again, there are downsides to it. Maybe, Ben, you can address some of those.
Well, and just to add to that, so often half a dozen different online platforms in the last few weeks, depending on what different clients and colleagues are using. So it's certainly been a lesson for me. And I think many people are experiencing that. Something I do want to say, though, is even with all the technology and machines and whatnot, we are still humans, and we still need personal interaction. Relationships are as important as ever. And meetings online. But I don't think this is the death of the in-person meeting. I hope not, because those the energy and dynamism and connection that come from those so far, I think can't be fully necessarily replaced through online interaction.
Yeah, and maybe we can be more selective about them. And I'll just say one thing, just because we are in an area, I live in an area that's been pretty hard hit by COVID-19, not nearly as much as some other places, but we are under a stay-at-home social distancing order. And I know this, and everyone's at home, but everyone's walking out in the street, and people are gathered around 6 feet away from each other and just talking. There's just this human need for interaction. We see it in the midst of this.
Yeah.
That's a good point. In a time when we're doing our best to reduce further sprawl, how do you think the coronavirus will impact future land use decisions? In our jurisdictions, we are promoting more density in urban suburban areas to limit sprawl into our surrounding farmland. How do we keep this current threat from derailing our long-range planning efforts?
Yeah, and Dave and I responded to that before. I think it's too early. It's too early to know. And there's the other thing, the other challenge with all these drivers of change is sometimes they are at cross purposes. So, the benefits of density from reducing our carbon footprint, for example, are really important in trying to reduce the pace of climate change. And so we'll have to see how well some of these public health strategies like vaccines can sort of help us ultimately address pandemics. And, we also may see times when life continues as normal in our current patterns or evolving more dense patterns, but then
right now. But maybe there's a design opportunity here for designing COVID-safe communities that are actually dense and operate. It could be a design problem. I don't know. Maybe there's some like really creative architects out there and site planners who can figure that one out.
Okay.
I know in other countries that have had to deal with Ebola and that kind of thing, they use techniques like just checking everyone's temperature when they go into the grocery store. So, there may be strategies like that that still allow us to proceed in a similar way to the way we have in the past, as long as we just with a quick verification that we're not carrying something.
Yeah, and the problem, of course, is in some places like Singapore and elsewhere where they're getting the handle on, they're really intrusive. And like in Hong Kong, they're treating people that come from China, where the outbreak was. They quarantine them for 2 weeks, and they make them wear anklet braces, or they track their movement to make sure they're not contacting others. And then so it can be very intrusive. So could you have something, Ben? That was an interesting idea. Could you have something that's not intrusive? It could be some kind of scanner or something that you just walk through. But even that sounds creepy to me. So who knows?
It's a brave new world, and I think we're all learning and discovering what this recent event will mean for us.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more and we'll wrap up. To what extent should planning play a part in emergency management plans and preparedness plans? For example, to plan to reduce the impact of bushfires and to respond to events?
I think there's a major role to play, and that's actually something APA, where I worked till last year sometime, as through its hazards planning program, has done a lot of work on. And part of that, the idea was to bring together planners, emergency management professionals, hazard mitigation professionals together to work together, because it's all one cycle. There's a preparedness, there's a response, but there's also planning makes a big difference. And actually the wildfire is a good example. PAS, if you're an APA member, you have access to a planning for wildfire report that was published last year, which talks about the different planning and ordinances, planning approaches to reducing wildfire risk in the wildland-urban interface. So planners have a really important role to play in that through how we deal with land use regulations, et cetera.
Great point, David. And APA also released a PAS report on resilient infrastructure recently as well. Really outstanding piece of work. So go to planning.org and check out those resources.
Okay. The 4 categories of change in the 3-step process are applicable no matter where one plans, but within smaller and more rural communities, data and resources can be scarce. How might such places adapt this methodology?
I can take a first crack at that maybe. I think there's a lot of local knowledge that can be tapped from people who have lived and in those communities for many years and seen the changes in the environment and the community. So the source of information doesn't have to be numbers from some national or international aggregation service. It can be people in the community. So I think it's eminently applicable, and it's really all about figuring out what the issues are for your place, wherever it is, whatever the context is, and organizing yourself to track these issues and make systematic progress in preparing yourself to handle them. David?
Yeah, I agree. And there's actually data available for everywhere, but the thing is that rural communities may have, or they do have less capacity to utilize that data. But I think a lot of this is common sense, and it's about working with what you have. And you can get too deep and too involved in data. And I think this is really a strategic thinking process that you need to go through and use some common sense. And I agree with the comments that Ben made. Rely on local people who know the place and what are your local assets, what are your vulnerabilities, and take it from there.
Okay, let's end with this question. What do you see as the top 3 beneficial societal changes that may result from this current pandemic?
Beneficial ones. Well, the first one that I'll do one, then maybe Ben can think of one, and then maybe I can think of a third. But the first one that immediately comes to mind is we'll get prepared for stuff like this. We're just so caught unprepared for this, and there's no reason for it. We need to be prepared for pandemics, for disasters, and just be prepared for this kind of what I call an acute shock from happening. So better preparedness, I think, is one benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when sort of, as I've watched with everyone as this phenomenon has played out, to me, it's really highlighted in a way that few other things have that I can think of about how we're all in this together. We have, as David highlighted when he talked about globalization, we're all in this together. Nations, neighborhoods, communities, states, nations need to collaborate if we're going to deal with these issues effectively. So it's rare that, when I think of my life, I didn't live through any of the world wars. This is one of the few truly global events where I felt like my daily life was affected by things that were happening on the other side of the world. And so hopefully others feel that way and feel a sense of kinship and are motivated to collaborate in ways that we may have resisted in the past. And maybe it'll contribute in some small way to bringing us together more as a world.
Yeah, and I'll do it. If mine was 1, Ben's was 2nd, I'll do a 2A instead of 3 because, again, it's based on my observation of what's happening in a local community. My wife said, people are really friendly all of a sudden. Everyone's friendly, and you're saying hello to people and having conversations at a 6-foot distance. But it's it wasn't there before. There's maybe it will build that sense of community and cut across some of the horrible divides we've been seeing. That may be too much to ask at this point, but at least at a community level, it's it has the potential to bring communities together. And we will get beyond this to the other side, but it's going to be some it's going to be some pretty dire stuff, I'm afraid, that's going to happen between now and then. But we will get through it.
Great. Well, thank you both. That kind of is a good way to stop, but did you all have any other concluding thoughts you'd like to share?
I think that's perfect.
I'm good.
Okay. So with that, I would like to thank David and Ben for participating with us today, and this will conclude our webinar, ProAct Now, Planning Effectively in a Rapidly Changing World. I'd like to thank both of them for a great presentation, and to all of those of you who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, helps to make all of this happen, especially now that we're all working remotely. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org next week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our e-newsletters for details on other future webinars. We're going to endeavor to provide you with planning webinars through this period of teleworking for many planners. So if you have a topic, panel, or suggestion, please include it in your evaluation or email me at michael.bayer1@maryland.gov, which is included on the webinar information. We do also have a number of upcoming webinars that we're going to be doing with Island Press, including one on April 7th, Designing the Mega Region and Healing the Divided City. April 14th, Unleashing the Economic and Sustainability Power of Existing Buildings, and April 28th, Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities.